Story 1. It was not a deathbed confession, but my grandmother told us that her father and uncles murdered the man who raped her and disposed of the body. She waited until after they had all passed away to tell people. Story 2. My great-grandfather came home from World War I, and his family had a big party. He noticed his 13-year-old sister was missing, so he went to look for her. He found their neighbor assaulting her. He pulled the man off her and told her to go to their mother. We do not know if he beat him or killed him immediately, but on her deathbed, my grandmother said she hid his bloody clothing buried in the front yard from that night, and the body is long gone. Where the clothing is supposedly buried, there is now a beautiful patch of irises that grows. Story 3. Not a confession, but a pretty funny story about my grandfather. I was the closest person to him in the family. I was flying home to see him and missed him passing by an hour. When I arrived, everyone started asking me questions. It seems he sat up in bed, turned to others and said, "Let me tell you a story. I'm not his name. I am an assassin, and my name is Jonas McGilfrey. I've hidden $2 million in gold bullets." He then lay down and passed away. The entire family thought I had to know about it because of how close we were. I used to skip school and go to his house all the time when he got a new silent film on VHS. I had no idea what he was talking about. The family spent a lot of time trying to figure it out. I stumbled across the answer a few years later. He was a big Louis Lamar fan. I wasn't, but on a whim, I picked up a book and started reading. Right there, the book started out, "I'm not XXXXXX. My name is Jonas McGilfrey, and I've hidden 2 million in gold bullets." I know it's not exactly how it was worded in the book, but close enough. It's been almost 30 years now. I gave the book to my mom, and she's shared it with the family. It's just like my grandfather to pull something like this. He was an absolute character in life. I miss him greatly, and I still laugh at this. Story 4. My mother started confessing to killing her friend when she was a teenager. She had been senile for about a year and usually did not talk much, but she was speaking directly and clearly. Her story was very detailed, and we were just sitting there horrified. A few hours later, she was back in a more sedated state, and someone realized it was the plot of a book by an author she loved. I do not know how much she was aware of anything at that point. She died early the next morning, but she would have absolutely laughed if she knew what she did to us. Story 5. My grandfather looked at me when I was 16 and apologized for the sexual assault he committed against my mother when she was a child. It still troubles me to this day that he did that and thought I would be the person to forgive him. Story 6. A nurse once shared that an old man confessed to sabotaging his brother's parachute during World War II because they were in love with the same woman. His brother died, and the woman married someone else anyway. He said he lived with the guilt every single day. Story 7. Not really anything compared to murders and such, and not really a confession, but the day my great-grandfather died, he asked me to retrieve a suitcase from under his bed and throw it away. It was full of adult magazines and adult toys. He was 98, so good for him, but also I wish I had just thrown it away. Story 8. Not quite a confession, but near the end of my mother's life, she asked, "Where are my boys?" My twin, and I thought she meant girls. So we told her we were there. After she died, the day before the funeral, we received a call from a private investigator asking if they could speak to my mother. I told them she had just passed away, and the private investigator shared that they represented a client looking for their biological mother. I initially thought it was someone who had heard my mother had passed and was trying to get money. At the time, I was grieving, so it seemed plausible. I decided to hear her out, and she was absolutely describing my mother and parts of her life that no scammer would have known. It turned out our mother had 2 boys from 2 different men prior to marrying our father. One of the men was from her hometown, the other was from Japan. So much of her life before our father was a mystery. Both her sisters had Alzheimer's, so no information was ever shared with us. Story 9. I do not think I would call this a confession, but it was just before he died. I volunteered at a hospice, and there was a man who had severe dementia. Before he passed, he started reliving a moment from when he was drafted for the Vietnam War. He mistook me and another volunteer for his war buddies. Apparently, they had murdered a man and his family when they got back. From what he said, it was not supposed to be the whole family, but things spiraled and they ended up killing the man, his wife, and her parents. He was unnervingly calm, not panicked, just calculated. He did not acknowledge anything we told him. He was stuck in that memory. He was in the middle of describing how to hide the bodies when he slipped back into his normal self and then refused to talk about anything further to anyone. He passed away shortly before dinner time the same day. Story 10. It's nowhere near the level of what some of these are, but growing up my mother and grandmother had always been very estranged. They had an arm's-length relationship, and the only times we visited were generally disasters. To her credit, my mom tried and wanted me to have a grandmother and the memories that came with it. She tried her best, but something was very off. Small details trickled out over the years, but they were vague. When it was time for my grandmother to die, I remember visiting her on her deathbed. My mother did not, and my grandmother told me right before she passed, "Tell your mother I always really loved her, despite everything." That was a strange thing for her to say, because why would that have been something she needed to say? I didn't tell my mom right away because, after my grandmother died, she was oddly emotionless, and I felt it was not something my mom needed to hear just then. A few years later, the truth came out when we were talking over the phone. My mom told me that when she was 5, my grandmother tried to run her over with a car because she found out her affair partner was molesting my mother. She wanted to get rid of her. It didn't work because a neighbor saw and intervened. So my mom ended up being sent overseas to her father's mother's home to be safe while the situation was dealt with and my grandparents got divorced. Times being what they were, however, when my mom returned, her mother got custody of her. It ended with my mother running away, being homeless, getting pregnant very young by a much older man, a secret sister I never knew about, and I was pretty floored. When she told me, I figured that it made a little more sense why my grandmother had said that, so I shared that with my mother finally. She just said, well, she had a strange way of showing it. And that was that. Story 11. I watched a video about an elderly woman in Alaska who talked about how she killed her abusive husband in Tennessee. She thought about it for months, having been abused during and before that time. Then she asked him to fix something high up in the barn, hit some rakes under the hay, and push the ladder, causing him to fall on the rakes and die. She called the police, which was around the 1940s or 1950s, and they investigated, concluding he fell by accident. She then moved to Alaska and lived a long, fulfilling, and happy life. Story 12. Not really a deathbed confession, but I was working in a hospital geriatric ward when I walked into the room of an older ill woman who immediately confided in me that she did not have a vagina but had been married for 35 years and kept her husband very happy. That always stuck with me. I did not know how to respond. Maybe her intent was to get me to remember her. Story 13. An 80-year-old patient told me that when his wife was dying, she admitted to having multiple affairs throughout their nearly 60-year marriage. She went as far as to say she never loved him and that his only son was not his. I was transporting him to the emergency department. He likely had only months left to live and wanted to share this with me. I still think about this often. Story 14. Not really a confession, but supposedly my great-grandmother's second husband was a terrible person. Like a kid-diddling, money-grubbing type. My dad and my aunt always told me that when that man passed away, he did not go peacefully. He kept seeing things on the ceiling, crawling on his legs, and was screaming, "Get them off me! Get them off me! Don't let them take me!" That story always creeped me out as a kid. Story 15. My grandma is almost 90. She had several brothers and sisters. All of them have blonde hair and blue eyes. She has brown hair, brown eyes, and a slightly darker skin tone. On my great-grandma's deathbed, she said, "I need to tell you something. When I was younger, I had an affair with a Cherokee man. My grandma had already figured this out long ago. She always told me that she was half Cherokee. A couple of years ago, my dad did a genealogy kit from Ancestors.com. 0% Native American. I was told not to tell grandma. Story 16. My grandmother was on her deathbed and was convinced she was going to hell because she had stolen money from the church rectory 50 years earlier to help feed her 10 young children. I think my aunts found her saying that more upsetting than her actual death. Not because of the stealing, as we all agree that a compassionate God would not condemn someone who stole to feed their children, but because of how adamant she was that she was going to hell because of it. Created some drama before she passed, for sure. Rest in peace, Grandma. Story 17. Context. My mom was the last person I really had in my close family, sort of a deathbed confession. My mom, after she died, left me her will and a letter. In that letter, she told me I was adopted. I had asked repeatedly over the years if I was adopted. Basically, everyone who knew my parents knew. That upset me a lot, not gonna lie. So if you, my dear readers, have adopted a child, please tell them before you die and don't lie to them, because that was an immensely painful way to find out. Story 18. I used to care for people who were disabled in some way in their homes. One man I cared for was elderly, over 80 years old, and needed help with day-to-day tasks like cooking, cleaning, and driving. He was inappropriate with women and had cognitive issues, mainly impulse control problems. This led to inappropriate comments, shoplifting, and wandering that required redirection back to the house. One evening, while sitting on his porch, he asked me the date. After I told him, he became very emotional and sad, sharing that it was the day he lost his family. I knew he had no family who visited or cared for him and had been supported by agencies for decades. I saw obituaries hanging in his house. Only one listed him as a survivor. It was clear his family had excluded him from a young age. He confessed that, as a teenager, he had harmed his little sister. When she told, he strangled her to death. He described how he buried her under a sign next to the road, the dress she wore, and said things like, "Mommy was never the same," and "Daddy tried to kill me when they found her." I will never know if this was a false memory from his cognitive decline or the true reason he had no family and was omitted from most obituaries, except his grandmother's. However, I believed him because it felt different from his usual stories, which were often exaggerated or untrue. He passed away a few weeks later. Story 19. My maternal grandfather confessed that he saw the ghost of his daughter, who had died a few years earlier, the day before he had a major heart attack that took his life. It later came to light that he had sexually abused her as a child, and my grandmother basically knew and did nothing to protect her children. The revelation tore my family apart, but not until nearly 20 years after he died. Story 20. We thought my granny was dying. The hospital has asked us all, my mum, my brother, and my sister, to come and say goodbye. We are going in one by one with my mum. One of the things my granny keeps mentioning is that she is sad for me because I am single and will not be having any intimate relationships. It is good to know where her priorities were when she was about to die. Story 21. I did not hear it directly, but my great-grandfather told my grandparents on his deathbed that he had another family before meeting my great-grandmother after World War II. His wife and children died in a Nazi concentration camp, and he was the only one to survive. We do not know any other details. I did not get to know my great-grandfather, but I still think about him and what he lived through sometimes. Story 22. I am a nurse. A coworker of mine received a true deathbed confession. She was actively dying and said they will never find him. He deserves it. She then went to sleep and passed away an hour later. Story 23. My grandmother told my sister and me that our uncle, her oldest, was not actually my grandfather's son. She was assaulted by her brother-in-law's brother and met my grandfather soon after. He didn't care that my uncle wasn't his. He raised him just as if he were his own. She asked us to never tell anyone. We never have. Story 24. A man on hospice care for cancer summoned his children a day or two before he died to confess that he had killed his wife, who was the mother of the children and had been reported missing about 30 years earlier. He had planned everything perfectly. The wife had some kind of trip planned. The man killed his wife, rented a wood chipper, dismembered her, and disposed of the remains by feeding them into the wood chipper and releasing them into a sizable stream on their property. Afterward, he set the wood chipper on fire, let it burn, and then filed an insurance claim a few days later. When the wife failed to return home from her trip, he reported her missing. The children had absolutely no clue. The crime would have gone completely unsolved if he had not confessed. I did not hear the confession but was involved with some search warrants on the property after the children reported it to the state police. Story 25. Oh man, I finally have a story. I worked as a magnetic resonance imaging technician aide in college, and my job was simply to bring people to and from their hospital room for an MRI. One day, I was asked to get this nice, elderly Italian man. He was a big man, about 6 feet 4 inches tall and 260 pounds. I would have placed him in his early 70s. Sadly, he had early onset dementia. We had short but pleasant conversations on the way to and from the MRI. On the way back to his room, he told me how he was the guy called when his friends needed to take care of business. I believe my naive response was something along the lines of, "Oh, what kind of business were your friends in?" "All kinds. But they would call me when they needed to take care of someone." That's when it hit me what he was saying. I chuckled to myself, attributing it to the dementia as we got back to his room. When we arrived, his 3 children and their spouses, ranging from about 40 to 50 years old, were all there waiting on him. You could tell they were saddened by their father's condition, but nevertheless, they were kind and smiled at me as I began hooking him back up to his oxygen and heart monitors. One of his daughters asked how he had been. The gentleman said he was feeling okay and had just gotten back from an MRI with me. It was at that moment that he said to his family, very nonchalantly, "Yeah, I was just telling this young man how I used to take care of business back in the day." At that moment, all 6 faces turned somber in unison and looked at me in unison. "Ah, well, yes. What a great story. Have a nice day, everyone," I said in the most cheerful voice I could muster. I never mentioned a word. I don't even remember the gentleman's name, probably for the best. Story 26. Not a deathbed confession, but when my aunt was a college student in the late 1960s, she applied for a grant to study ecology in Borneo. She delayed accepting her fiancé's proposal while she waited for an answer. She waited and waited. My grandmother, who was a huge fan of my aunt's fiancé, worried that the relationship would not survive if she went to Borneo for a year. She was incredibly relieved when my aunt took the silence as a rejection and accepted his proposal. Decades later, living a happy life with a successful husband and 3 high-achieving daughters, my aunt mentioned the time she wanted to study in Borneo. That was when my grandmother told her that the day before the wedding, an envelope had arrived at my grandparents' house, informing my aunt that her grant application had been approved. Concerned she would spoil the future, my grandmother threw the envelope in the trash. Story 27. When I was 10 or 11, my grandfather passed away from cirrhosis of the liver. He was a happy, functioning alcoholic. I was alone with him in his hospital room the day he died, scared because he looked very different from the man I had always known. He had lost nearly half his body weight and looked skeletal. He held my hand and told me that his father, my great-grandfather, killed 4 men in their beds with an ice pick because they had assaulted a black girl, and the law did nothing about it. He described it in gruesome detail that still troubles me 35 years later. I did not understand at the time, but years later, when I told my mother about it, she confirmed and explained it more gently. Apparently, my great-grandfather and his brother may have also been professional or serial killers, reportedly killing over 25 members of the Ku Klux Klan across Alabama, Georgia, and northern Florida. Story 28. One of those is not a confession either, but I was told by my mother that my grandfather on my father's side killed a man in his youth because that man owed my grandfather a lot of money. She said that my grandfather buried the gun and never spoke about it again. This all happened in a very rural part of their home country. It was mostly barren land with farms. Story 29. My grandmother confessed to me that her oldest brother was the product of incest. My great-grandmother had him when she was 14. To be clear, her father, my great-great-grandfather, raped her. I was 17 when she told me this, and I said I would not have been able to raise that baby. She said, she had no choice. That story scared me deeply in 1997. Story 30. Not quite deathbed, I was recovering from hospice but then returned to hospice. My grandfather was in the hospital and talking to my grandmother and me. He was pretty out of it and had this conversation with my grandmother. When I get out of here, we're getting a hotel. Why, honey? So we can have hot wild sex. He was 86, and I said, okay, I'm going to go get a soda. Story 31. I work as an emergency room nurse. A couple of months ago, there was a massive crash on the highway involving around 20 cars. It was unclear who caused it. Because many people were hurt and no one knew whose fault it was, they did not know which insurance company would pay for everything. The treatments were very expensive for many patients, and most insurance plans only partially covered the bills. There was one older man in a car with his wife who died on impact. In his last moments, he told me to put the blame on him and to tell everyone he confessed to causing the crash. He did it because his insurance was top tier, and he knew it would help people. It is not very disturbing, but I think it is quite interesting. Story 32. My ex's grandmother told me that she hit someone with her car and kept driving, thinking they were an animal. Later, it was discovered that one of her friend's husbands was walking home drunk after spending time with a friend and was hit by a car. It was most likely him. He recovered but was permanently injured and had issues walking and pain for the rest of his life. No one believed me when I told them she said that. Story 33. Not a confession, but as my grandmother was about to die, she rattled off a list of names of people to whom she owed a debt of favor or gratitude, and a list of people who had wronged her. She made sure my father knew and remembered. My grandmother was tough as nails and survived enough horrors for multiple lifetimes. Japanese occupation during World War II, Chinese Civil War, Cultural Revolution, and so on. I like to think it was her way of making sure that even death could not save people who had wronged her from her wrath. If you are a Star Trek fan, yes, this is very Cardassian. Story 34. My great-grandmother fostered 9 children and adopted 2. She tried for 7 years to conceive. My grandmother was her only biological child. This was in the 1940s and 1950s. She became frustrated trying with her husband and became pregnant by the neighbor, who had 3 daughters. The families were very close and spent holidays together. I guess the neighbor looked very much like my great-grandfather. Nobody ever questioned it. Her husband died years before, and she had Alzheimer's disease, so we did not get much of an explanation. We like to think it was agreed upon and that my great-grandfather was aware, since this was before surrogacy and in vitro fertilization. But we truly have no clue. Story 35. Not exactly a deathbed, but near it. When I first started dating my wife, her grandmother made a speech about making sure I would treat her granddaughter right and not abuse her. She said she slipped extra acetaminophen into her abusive husband's coffee, and he died of a massive heart attack. I thought she was just making something up to scare me. At her funeral, I brought up that joke, and my wife said her grandfather died of a massive heart attack. I think she actually did it. Story 36. One weekend, a dementia patient repeatedly told me about someone he and his friends beat up and assaulted after the war. I assumed it was around the early 1950s. Apparently, they took his wallet, but what struck me was the undertone and the lack of panic in his voice. Usually, dementia patients who think something is lost or stolen are very anxious. He was not. He just kept saying he and his friends beat the man badly and took his wallet. I am almost certain he was talking about a racial hate crime. The timing adds up and his details were too precise. He was a respectful man with a good family, wife, and children. A good Midwestern family man. Something happened with him and his friends one night, and it was not good. There was regret in the story, but it seemed like he finally wanted to tell someone. I have been a nurse for 15 years. I worked in a locked dementia unit at the start of my career. I completed the week-long dementia state certification to become a trainer. I know dementia well and interact well with patients. You go to their world and live there with them. This was different, though. He kept repeating the same story all weekend, and the details did not change. That is unusual for a dementia patient. It was not a story or behavior he was known for repeating. I am convinced that he was reliving that night from 60 years ago and telling me something happened. It was not a dementia false reality. I will never forget him. I still remember what room he was in and everything about it. This was the only time I have been spooked. I have had over 2,000 patients and been present for over 100 deaths. This was different. Story 37. Before my grandmother passed, she acknowledged that in 1949, at the age of 17 and a senior in high school, she became pregnant with my mother. She was obviously not married to my grandfather until 4 months later. I told her that we could all do the math, already knew her secret, and loved her anyway. Story 38. When my country was suffering a civil war, a little girl around 6 years old who lived near my grandmother was bitten by a dog with rabies. They could not vaccinate her, and the girl started to show symptoms. Since the disease is deadly at this stage, the doctor and the family decided that the most humane solution was to mercy kill her. My grandmother, who was a teenager then, still remembered that the whole family was crying while walking down the street to the doctor's office. The father was holding the little girl, and she was trying to eat bread but could not swallow it. She had a little foam at the corners of her mouth. My grandmother was haunted by the little girl's story her whole life. Story 39. My patient told me to tell her daughter that she was right the whole time. When the daughter came in, I did. The patient had just passed away. The daughter stared at me, became upset, and yelled that I was lying. I stood quietly and left the room. Apparently, the woman was not her biological mother, and she had kidnapped her. The daughter did genetic testing and discovered some relatives. The mother never admitted it. I wish I could have found out more. Story 40. My great-grandmother told me that our family built the aqueducts in Spain. Many years ago, our cousins stole our fortune, and anyone from our family who went to claim it has disappeared. Story 41. I found out that on my grandmother's deathbed, she told a couple of my aunts that she cheated on my grandfather for years and the 3 youngest children, out of 14, were not my grandfather's kids. I am 35 and just discovered this information 2 years ago, and it affected me for weeks. Story 42. I worked with a patient with dementia for a few days in a hospital setting who was constantly rambling nonsense, but would occasionally say sexual things like, "I love your breasts." I am male, so I assumed he was either hallucinating or reliving something from his past. One day, after we were able to get him to eat something, he went to sleep for a while. When he woke up a few hours later, he looked me straight in the eyes and, clear as day, said, "I used to make love to my mother, and I can't wait to see her again." He then went back to rambling before falling back to sleep. He quickly deteriorated and passed away before the end of my shift. I always wonder if it was the truth or nonsense, but it has always stuck with me. Story 43. My grandpa, on his deathbed, was a hardened World War II veteran who never cried in his life. He finally broke down to my dad and my uncles, saying that he had always felt sorry for killing those German boys. It is so sad to think that he had to bottle up those feelings for 70 years. Story 44. I have been a nurse for 40 years. At least 8 elderly women, close to death but not demented, have told me they were raped and became pregnant by a man they dated. When their families found out, they were forced to marry the man who raped them. Story 45. My grandfather's brother spent 20 years in prison for killing a police officer. I was one of the people taking care of him when he was in home hospice. The day before he died, we were just chatting about nothing in particular. He grabbed my hand suddenly, looked at me, and said, "I didn't kill him." I said, "The police officer?" He nodded and repeated that he was not the one who killed him. I asked who did, but he would not tell me. Story 46. Not really a confession because he didn't do anything wrong, but when I was an 18-year-old certified nursing assistant, I had a patient who was a very sweet elderly man. He was in our facility on hospice because he didn't want his family to have to provide his end-of-life care. I was with him every day. I worked for over a month, and we got along extremely well. I was very close to my grandparents and great-grandmother, so I get along very well with elderly people and enjoy conversations with them. This patient was a World War II veteran. As he got closer to death, he wanted to talk about his experiences in the war. He said he never talked to his family about them because he didn't want them to live with knowing, but he just needed to talk, and I said I didn't mind. I sat with him for a while after my shift and made him tea. He told me about how he was the pilot of one of the boats that carried soldiers to Omaha Beach on D-Day. He said it was the worst thing he ever did, knowing many of those men and boys would die, listening to them being sick and scared, and then cleaning what was left of some of them out of the boat afterward. He said he felt tremendous guilt about carrying them to their deaths for the rest of his life. I didn't really know what to say. I just listened. I thanked him for being so brave and told him that none of those people would have wanted him to feel guilty for doing his part and that they would be waiting to see him when he got to heaven so they could tell him so. I hope it helped. Story 47. When my paternal grandmother died in 2022, she confessed that my paternal grandfather was not actually my paternal grandfather. The reason my dad is much darker than his sisters is not because his legal father was half Sicilian, but because his real father was a Mexican man she was involved with while her husband was in Vietnam. Story 48. About a week before her death, my mother told me how she had been sexually abused as a young girl by a family member who was supposed to be taking care of her. She explained how her family knew and did nothing about it. This immediately explained the anxiety and distancing from family she had maintained throughout my lifetime. It broke my heart to hear this because she was always a kind and loving mother. Story 49. I am a nurse and have been for a long time. When I first became a nurse, I worked in long-term care not because I wanted to but because it was all I could get. After reading these stories, I realized that two of the women I loved working with were sharing things with me instead of their families. Both were pretty tame, considering. The first was a woman from an affluent background with a large, loving extended family. Her confession was that she was an alcoholic for many years and hid it from her family. The second woman's story was more serious. Her first husband was very abusive, and she tried to leave him. She had an affair with his friend, and about 4 of her 7 children were the friends. She eventually had to leave one night with only the clothes on her back. She and the abusive husband's friend lived happily ever after until he passed away from cancer. She said she could not wait until her time came so she could be with him again. Story 50. We had an old family friend who was dying of cancer. He had always been madly in love with my mother, but it never worked out. My brother went to visit him in the hospital. He motioned for my brother to come closer and then said quietly, "Your mother was one of this city's most legendary drug dealers." Story 51. Not exactly on her deathbed, but towards the end of her life. My great-grandmother was born in 1904 and married a man who died in 1936. She told us that he was a high-ranking member of the Ku Klux Klan in Springfield, Missouri, and had participated in at least 2 lynchings that she knew of. She said he kept the shoes of one of the victims because they were too good for him. My great-grandmother was strange. She was pretty bigoted herself but introduced me to television shows with a mostly black cast like The Jeffersons, Good Times, and Sanford and Son. For some reason, she loved those shows, and I cannot reconcile that with her Klansman husband and her open racism. She died in 1994. Story 52. My grandfather apparently told my mother that he thought he killed his last wife, not my grandmother but his wife after her. He had dementia at the time of the confession. She died suddenly, but I did not know there was anything suspicious until my mother told me that he had held a knife to my grandmother more than once while they were together. He was a terrible person, but I did not realize how terrible until he was gone. Story 53. A former gang member who was the enforcer for a well-known gang in our area was dying of cancer with a prognosis of less than 2 weeks. He confessed to making a few people disappear and wanted their families to find closure by telling them where he buried the bodies. The police got involved, of course. Interestingly, it did not make the news. I think he might have insisted on keeping it under the radar, as it would not have reflected well on the gang. Story 54. Just commenting to point out how many of these stories are grandmothers admitting they were raped. I am not ready for my grandmother or my mother to die for many reasons, and one of them is because I have a bad feeling I will be hearing similar confessions from both. Story 55. I used to work as a hospice nurse, and there was one family I was working with where the father was sick with liver cancer, a lifelong alcoholic, sadly a typical outcome, with metastases to the stomach and bone. These were the sources of most of the pain we struggled to control. We had finally transitioned him to fentanyl patches, and he was balancing between the relief of opioids and brief interruptions from the severe effects of cancer destroying his body. Still, even in these difficult scenarios, there are strange moments of lucidity that break through. One nurse told us about a lady who had gone to bed about a month prior. Generally, with cancer, once patients go to bed, they do not come back from it, or if they do not recover much. They were having a family meeting with the nurse and other members of the treatment team when she suddenly sat up and told everyone, "I've been talking with the administrator, and he told me that everything is going to be fine." Then she lay back down and died. So, while it was surprising, it was not out of place when this man, who was in his 80s, suddenly sat up and had one of these moments. It is always surprising no matter how many times it happens. You are never prepared for it. He sat right up and looked around the room. Then I could swear I heard a little drum beating somewhere, and he began to shout, "I like to move it, and proceeded to sing the entire song from memory with the family backing his vocals like one collective hype man. It was truly magical and the kind of story that people will never believe unless they are there to see it. Story 56. I asked my father, before he passed away, if there were any family secrets. No. However, at his funeral, I learned that my mother's grandmother shot a woman in church. A week later, during lunch with his racist cousin, I realized the family feud on his side was not about $600, but about racism. I wish I had asked my father if he married a black woman out of spite. Either way, I am glad he did. Story 57. Not disturbing or a deathbed confession, but my grandmother was in poor health when she told me. She said that she had a relationship with Frank Sinatra. I believe her because she was a somewhat famous burlesque dancer. Story 58. That elderly white woman admitted she had lied as a teenager about a black boy assaulting her. The boy was killed and he was innocent. Story 59. When my great-grandfather, who partially raised me, was on his deathbed, he said that he never loved my grandmother. Every time he accidentally ran over her foot with his heavy wheelchair and she screamed for him to move, he took his time pretending to be confused. He admitted that when he got drunk and violent, he wasn't actually that drunk. He just wanted to hurt her. When he intentionally made her fall and crack her head open, he was genuinely trying to kill her. Every time she had a health scare, he prayed to God that she would suffer and die. I'm glad he died soon after because I would have done it myself. He was always a monster to me and our whole family and almost killed me multiple times as a child, as well as his own children. He constantly looked for reasons to beat me bloody because he wanted to. I hope hell is real and that he is in the deepest pit of it. I can't believe my grandmother still misses and grieves for him. He was literally Satan. Story 60. Ours is a bit roundabout. My father passed away last year, and a month later, one of his cousins did as well. Before she died, she informed my mother that my paternal grandfather had a secret second family. She was the last person who knew and felt that someone should know. It turns out my father knew and intended to take it to the grave. He had been told by his mother, when she was on her deathbed, and swore him to secrecy. The cousin only knew because, in the 1950s, my grandfather made a stop to drop off some cash with the other family on the way home from my aunt's funeral. The cousin was in the car. My mother and I managed to piece things together and track down this other previously unknown branch of the family. We have established contact, and they were as surprised as we were. They are good people. It turns out my half-cousin is a fairly successful gospel singer. Not exactly dark, but it is my example when I explain that Southern families are built on secrets and lies. Story 61. Not necessarily a deathbed confession. Sorry, I don't have anything else. 3 years ago, I reconnected with a friend from high school. I remember texting with her briefly, catching up and working through the issues we had when we were younger. I was in college and working 2 jobs, so I didn't have time to chat much. One of our conversations came to her sobriety and avoiding certain kinds of drugs. She was proud that she was sober. She told me, "Don't touch anything but marijuana, MDMA, or nicotine." I didn't think much of it at the time and went about my day. She was an addict. She died from an overdose 2 weeks later. I miss her. Story 62. The last thing my grandfather said to me before he died was, "Women are stupid. It made my grandmother burst out a nervous laugh, like, "Oh, he's just being cheeky." But the look he gave me and then her was definitive. I left and he died a couple of days later. Story 63, sort of a deathbed confession. It took place over about a year before he died. My very smart, very secretive neighbor had a stroke and developed a condition called atypical aphasia. In typical aphasia, the victim cannot talk. This man could not stop talking. He did not just babble, he had to communicate with someone about something. It turned out that he used to work on the United States military's secret germ warfare program. He had near-perfect memory. He remembered names, dates, dosages, protocols, everything. He was compelled to talk about it to anyone near him all day, every day. The local television station sent a camera crew to record him. I listened for a while, but it was brutal. I could not bear the desperate, non-stop stream of information for more than a few hours. I probably should have taken notes. I do miss him. Story 64. A few years ago, my mother knew a woman who was diagnosed with late-stage cancer. Before she passed away, she made a shocking confession to her husband. She told him that all three of their sons were not his biological children. Their real father was actually her own father. The boys were around 10, 8, and 7 years old at the time. After she died, the husband had DNA tests done, which confirmed that he was not the biological father. The tests also showed that the boy's biological father was indeed their maternal grandfather. The woman's father, who was in his 70s, was arrested and later sent to prison, where he eventually died. Despite learning the truth, the husband decided to raise the boys as his own. He said he had noticed early on that there was something different about them. For example, they did not seem to feel pain the way other children did. At the time, he did not think much of it, but looking back, it stood out more clearly. Story 65. My wife, a geriatrician, told me this story. She had a patient who was considered just the loveliest by all who knew her and by all of her children. Now her children and their families are also successful individuals here in Melbourne, Australia, lawyers, doctors, university deans, and so on. A group of very neatly presented people, if you know what I mean. As the matriarch's dementia worsened, she began having extremely violent hallucinations and started sharing unfiltered tales of great violence. The family was very confused, but after she died, the oldest son explained to his siblings that their mother was actually taken as a young teen in East London by a gang leader and was forced to be his wife for many years. Throughout this ordeal, the woman studied and learned how to be a gangster and eventually became influential enough to stage a coup against him, take all his money, and end his gang. She then escaped to Australia with the money to start over and managed to lead and nurture a life of privilege for herself and for generations to come. I admire this woman greatly. Story 66. My ex-husband's grandfather confessed to murdering and dumping the body of a man who raped the grandfather's then wife. She ended up killing herself and it ruined his life, so he had nothing to lose. He came back from his deployment, found out, apparently stalked the man, learned his schedule, and told the family he got him on the bridge and took care of him. The man was a missing person for over 50 years. In my opinion, the grandfather did society a favor. Story 67. My grandmother asked for a Coca-Cola the day before she died. She never drank Coca-Cola and always disliked it. A couple of days ago, it was 6 years. I miss you, Maggie. Story 68. My mother was dying. Hospice had told me death was imminent. 3 days after she slipped into a coma, with no food or water, the hospice nurse said she had been doing this for more than 20 years, and my mother was holding on for something or someone. We had all said our goodbyes, so the only possibility was our father. He was the love of her life and left her at 41 with 5 children for his nurse, a much younger woman. I was the youngest child at 1 year old and the only girl. I had only ever seen them as arch enemies and in the same room only at weddings or funerals. My 4 older brothers had essentially raised me and been my father. I discussed this with my brothers, and they agreed that I could call Dad and let him say goodbye, more importantly, to say, I'm sorry. I asked my father to say whatever was in his heart that he never felt he could express because this would be his last opportunity. My father agreed, So I put the phone to my mother's ear and laid my head on hers to monitor in case he decided to be unkind. That was my thought process because they hated each other. He started awkwardly with, "Sorry to hear you're not doing well." Then the floodgates opened when he realized he truly could say all that was in his heart. "I never stopped loving you. You were the best thing that ever happened to me. You are and always have been the love of my life. You raised 5 beautiful and amazing children all by yourself." I now realized that I was going through a midlife crisis. If only I had said I'm sorry. I could feel my mother moving, which she had not done in 3 days. So I sat up and looked at her to see her lips quivering and saw a tear sliding down her cheek. Worried I was causing her distress, I took the phone, thanked my father, and hung up while crying. My mother passed 15 minutes later. Regret and forgiveness. This was the single best life lesson my father could have taught me. To say I'm sorry when I need to and to wait before making any life changes that I might regret. All those wasted years were portrayed as hate because he was too proud to say, "I'm sorry." Story 69. Probably, "I have to tell you something, but not in front of everyone. Come back later and we will talk." And then she died. God damn it, Granny. Story 70. My grandmother, who did not know who her mother or father were, was told by her aunt on her aunt's deathbed that she was in fact her mother the whole time. Turns out the whole family knew the entire time. She was 60 when she found out. People can be very cruel, I swear. Story 71. When I was a teenager, I volunteered at a dementia ward and did my best to cheer up the residents with walks, reading, or whatever. I heard many bizarre stories during that time, but there was no way to sort truth from fiction. I just listened to the confessions, some of them heartbreaking, and didn't argue or question anything because there was no way to confirm most of it. I was particularly close to one resident who had been there a long time. We took long walks in the garden, and she told me things that felt scandalous to a sheltered kid like me. I vowed to take some of those confessions to the grave. 2 days before she died, she fell into a coma, but our last conversation stuck with me. She described her life on the farm and struggles after her husband passed many years ago, which her family had confirmed. Then she told me about a passionate emotional affair with a strong, good-looking black man named Moses, who helped her with the farm during hard times after her husband's death. A death she had never explained before. She said she never acted on physical urges because she was still in love with her husband, but praised Moses for helping with her children and household, and supporting her after she took in a male boarder to make ends meet. She told me how she saved him from arrest after he stole from her, forgave him, and how he nearly died in a beating later after helping her. He gave her a handkerchief that belonged to his mother as a goodbye, and she cherished it as a symbol of their unspoken feelings. I was blown away by this story. It brought tears to both our eyes. About 10 years later, I met one of her children at a community event. The daughter recognized me as the cheerful volunteer who had kept her mother company. She thanked me for my kindness. I shared some touching words her mother had said about each of her children, hoping to bring a smile. It worked. She thanked me again and asked if her mother had confessed anything else before she died. I hesitated to share the story about the farmhand but decided to tell it, thinking her mother was touched by her children's connection to him and maybe the daughter would remember him and the fond times. I recounted the story with as much detail and compassion as I could. The daughter stared at me unblinkingly for a moment, then burst out laughing. Apparently, it was the plot of a Sally Field movie from the 1980s, which her mother had latched onto in her final days. None of it was real memory. The farmhand was played by a young Danny Glover. That is how I learned about dementia confabulation. I was sad the story wasn't real because her mother told it with gratitude for Moses. However, it made me feel hopeful that some other residents' confessions might also have been confabulation, especially the darker ones that disturbed me. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.